What are some of the key differences, with ChainFlip and the way that you guys organize liquidity? I know that you have a pretty interesting vault system where, like you mentioned, liquidity flows in one way and then it has to ultimately be kind of arbitraged back. Can you just kind of give us a little bit of, technical insight into how that liquidity flow works?
Sure. So I think maybe a helpful way to frame this is to maybe look at how ThorChain does it, first of all. So ThorChain has these giant, big, old school V2 pools. And they store a lot of liquidity, but it's mainly backed in Rune and the external asset. And so because of the nature of V2 pools, it uses swaps against it. And then internally within, there used to be synths. I think trade accounts have now taken over. But basically, there's an arbitrager sitting on the ThorChain chain, constantly arbitraging the pool back into price. So the liquidity providers are actually pretty passive in this case. And the arbitragers are actually the one rebalancing the assets on the centralized exchanges when there's particular flows in one direction. So if someone's buying a lot of Bitcoin on ThorChain, the arbitrager will be selling a lot of Bitcoin on bigger venues to be able to facilitate that trade. And that's done over time using streaming swaps largely. It's the only way that ThorChain's been able to be price competitive. So before that, ThorChain really didn't have much organic volume. It was mainly arbitrage because it just wasn't competitive. It was like, doing a 200K swap, you'd be looking at several percent of slippage because of the nature of the pools, which at the time was like the best we had. But clearly, once streaming swaps came in place and allowed arbitrages, a much less, they had to deal with less spread over time, so they could just chunk away at these pools progressively over the course of several minutes or several hours in some cases. So that's how ThorChain works. We looked at it from a different angle. We created this thing called the JIT AMM a couple of years ago. And since then, you may have heard about intent-based swaps, things like Across or CalSwap are good examples of this in action. And this is sort of the reverse of what we've seen on chains so far. It's like instead of there being some fixed liquidity there that you can leverage and then is fixed afterwards, instead we sort of front load all of that background activity at the very beginning. So when a swap is coming in, we schedule that swap, and then every LP knows that that swap is going to happen. So now in order for them to win a liquidity fee, they have every incentive to offer the best price that they can. If they don't do that, the theory goes, and also in practice, is that someone else will end up winning that trade flow. And so there is a strong incentive to provide pricing which is as close to index pricing as you can get without incurring undue price risk. There's some complexities around that. There's some issues around block time and propagation speed and all that can affect the spread that market makers can actually offer. But essentially, the idea is it becomes an open auction for your trade. And that has the effect of not really depending on how much liquidity is available, but how competitive each liquidity provider can be given the balance of whatever asset they are buying or selling on both sides of the trade. So in that regard, we don't need arbitrage. The arbitrage is done ahead of time, or it's predicted ahead of time and hedged by the market makers before any trade has actually occurred. So there's no need to rebalance. The only downside of that is once you have nothing left to bid with, that's it. You can't bid anymore. So that's why that's where the liquidity constraints come in for ChainFlip and all intent-based systems right now. Is if the so-called solvers, or in our case, market makers, don't have anything to quote with, they can't trade. And so all of a sudden you'll go from having amazing pricing to having 100% slippage effectively because there's just nothing left. So we took that trade-off pretty early on, and it's been great to see the idea validated, because when we wrote about it first in 2022, JIT sandwich attacks were a thing on Uniswap, where essentially someone would sit there with a bot on Ethereum, and when a big trade came in on Uniswap, they would use MEV to create a situation where they would structure the transaction in such a way where they would have themselves deposit a large amount of liquidity into the pool, then the swap would be executed, and then they would have their liquidity removed. And then they would be doing the same thing that they're doing with ChainFlip. So we knew that this was a thing where people were using MEV to give users a better price, but to shaft all of the other LPs. People didn't really know what to make of it at the time. And now we have a word for it. It's called intents. And it quietly makes CowSwap one of the most widely used trading systems in crypto, but no one really knows about it because they don't really publish too many stats on it. But it is actually one of the biggest trading platforms in the space in terms of volume or organic flow. So we know these systems work. We know that they're really effective in getting users the pricing that they want. And we know that for us, it's been really, really effective with only having something like 1/40th of the capital available to us. We've been able to go toe to toe with with Thorchain on a bunch of trades since launch. So yeah, I hope that's a good explanation. Did that explain it?
Yeah, that's a great explanation, and yeah, it's definitely interesting to see how these different kind of capital efficiency models have evolved. And I had read briefly about what you described, but that was definitely a really, really solid like 5-minute breakdown of how it works at a high level.